to you from the Zoom webinar. Can you be more specific about the breathing technique used in the Breathe program? My patients in breathing physio are told not to take deep breaths as it will exacerbate hypocapnia.
Really?
I think you've just answered that.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
Don't hold your breath for too long.
Yes, yeah. To explain a little bit more then, the problem is that when the blood carries the oxygen from the lungs to the periphery, it needs something to replace it on the hemoglobin, the oxygen on the hemoglobin. Otherwise, it just stays on for the return ride. Normally, that's CO2. So if you've already overbreathed and driven your carbon dioxide level down, then there's nothing there to replace the oxygen, so it doesn't get delivered to the tissues.
Okay.
And so the breathing is normally, and you can follow this with things like capnometers, capnographs or whatever. You breathe in for 3, let's say, you breathe out for 3, and then you hold it out for 3. Now you can see on the graph, as you're holding it out for 3, your what's called the end-tidal CO2 gradually comes up like that. And so, yeah, that is the breathing.
Okay, thank you. Should we take a question from the audience? Where's Rachel? Rachel has a microphone. Any questions from the audience right now? Wendy, so while you make your way to Wendy, to Dr. Myhill, how do I know whether the gut is fermenting and how to alter it to a non-fermenting state?
Well, there are characteristic symptoms of the upper fermenting gut, like reflux, like bloating, like feeling full. So almost any gut symptom could be a manifestation of the upper fermenting gut. You treat it obviously by starving them out with stop feeding it, kill them with vitamin C, kill it with iodine, and you should feel a lot better. So I do it clinically. I don't have any tests that I do, and I deliberately call it upper fermenting gut because that covers fermentation by bacteria, non-specifically including H. pylori, and it includes fermentation by fungi. So it really is as simple as that.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Denning.
I was just 2 things. One, I was really pleased that you spoke about sleep. I listened to a lecture this week from a woman that was talking about resilience in teenagers, and they were talking about the fact that 95% of all mental health issues have lack of sleep as a huge contributing factor. Huge. It didn't matter what mental health they had. So, you know, I think it's really important. I wanted to ask about repurposed drugs and whether anyone's using them. There's about 5 that have been sort of bandied around, not to mention metformin, which probably is 6. And I've been using dipyridamole and famotidine, but there are 3 more on top of that. I just wanted to know from clinicians whether they'd had any experiences with any of the repurposed drugs for long COVID or indeed for COVID treatment.
Just briefly, and then other people welcome. On the sleep, what Gomenak says is that, I mean, obviously you need sleep for healing. And when you restore sleep to be good, she says that people sometimes sleep for a whole really long time to begin with, presumably getting rid of the backlog of repairs that need to be done. And then it gradually comes back to a more normal thing. Yeah. I can't help wondering how that interfaces with teenagers who have a tendency to sleep till 2 p.m. every day.
Different change of that, but I think it's so important at this time where we've got the pandemic, and that's why I brought it up, because it is a feature of long COVID, if you like. It's not long COVID, but it's a feature of the fact that we've all been in lockdown and out of school and whatever, that teenage mental health issues have risen exponentially. And if we don't address the sleep issue, then we're not really addressing a huge component to the problem.
Yeah, quite right. As far as the repurposed drugs, I only have one thing to say, which is that, as they say in Ireland, if I was going there, I wouldn't start from here. You know, I would start with the nutrition, or with the digestion, and then the nutrition.
Sure.
And so, and then maybe you move.
But everybody do have a look at the British ivermectin research development site set up by Tess Lowry, who's pulled together a huge number of studies, clearly showing how ivermectin is active against the coronavirus, and this is effective in both acute COVID and in long COVID. Very safe drug. Areas of India where you can buy it over the counter, there's been no pandemic there. So that's a very useful intervention.
I've just been asked if we can hold the microphones closer to our mouths for the benefit of the Zoom audience. Professor Thomas, what is the name of the polyphenol supplement mentioned in your study?
Well, I don't want to promote commercial things. I mean, the way we get our funding for our studies is we go out to companies who are willing to make what we design. So during the study, there was no name for it, but they obviously named the supplement after the study called Phyto-V. But that's their prerogative, as long as they stick to the formulation we went to, and it does. So it's called Phyto-V, and the probiotic is called Your Gut Plus.
Great.
Again, named after the study. But
and if you look back at the slides, you'll be able to see those details. Do we have a question in the audience? Okay. So going back to this morning, this is a question about ozone therapy. One from Dr. Finbar McGee. How many cycles or passes each visit? And Nigel Eccles, what's the length of benefit? Who wants that?
Yeah, I can comment on ozone. So, I mean, so I got into the passes more recently. So about, my experiences with the MAH, which is basically single passes. So, I'd say as a rule of thumb, once or twice weekly, try and aim for sort of 8 sessions, between 20 and 30 microgram. Rectal insufflations work as well. You start slow and you build it up in terms of strength and volume. Otherwise even ozonated water and other simpler approaches can have benefits.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any questions here?
Oh, hi. It's just regarding Navier's work and the cell danger response. I know that obviously the mitochondria after the initial injury purposely goes into a low metabolic state, and ATP works as a signaling stress molecule outside the cell. Now, Navier says sometimes we may not want to be supplementing with mitochondrial nutrients when it's purposely been put into a low metabolic state until we work around the stressors that are hindering the body getting back into the cell danger response. So I was just wondering your thoughts on that.
Can't escape the logic of it, but I think we've got a way to go in figuring out exactly how to put all this stuff into practice. Don't have a slick answer for you, sorry. Yes.
Yes, he does talk about Dauer, which is a German word for sort of hibernation, and does link that in many cases to infection or contaminants in the cell or heavy metals. And so it's certainly, I think, an important area of sequencing, which we have to a certain extent discussed today, which is looking at clues like that and then deciding how to go ahead and perhaps supporting the mitochondria with huge numbers of supplements at the beginning is not the way to go, because there's so much to remove, first of all. Yes, I do go with that totally.
Great, thank you. One from the webinar. Is there any standard care advice in early infection, and they've said e.g. taking paracetamol, which inadvertently contributed to the development of long COVID seen today? And I think I'd expand that. Is there anything you would recommend that people do in their initial infection to limit the risk of developing long COVID?
Well, don't symptom suppress with drugs. That's the first thing.
Yes.
And feed the immune system the raw materials it needs to fight, which is vitamin D, vitamin C, iodine, all the things we've been talking about today. But I'm quite sure that part of the reason why we're seeing so much post-viral fatigues these days is because the standard advice from GPs, if a child, for example, runs a fever, is suppress it with paracetamol. It's bad advice. It's absolutely wrong. We should say, no, fever is part of the physiological mechanism for fighting infection. We should encourage that. And yeah, enough said.
Thank you.
I would agree with that. I mean, it's one thing which really got my blood boiling when there was so much data coming out for vitamin D, for example. I mean, it was bound or obvious. If you're vitamin D deficient, you were going to get a worse infection. Yep. And we know that taking extra vitamin D, I mean, most people are in hospitals, they can't go sunbathing, so it's going to have to be a supplement. And when the panel of 3 actually stood up and said there's no evidence for vitamin D, in May last year. I mean, okay, there wasn't a double-blind randomized trial, but there was lots and lots of data coming through. And then they backpedaled 4 months later saying, oh, we need to take vitamin D, and got GPs to prescribe it. They wasted 4 months. I mean, it was just a sin. But anyway, coming back to the question, sorry. Yeah, I mean, vitamin D, I would actually say probiotics as well, because, you know, that's an easy thing to do. And lots of studies showing they're safe. They're certainly not going to do any harm. And I agree with the paracetamol. You know, obviously, if you're absolutely on your knees, use it sparingly. Dexamethasone, again, if you are literally about to be admitted to the high intensity ward as a way of quickly suppressing the cytokine storm, is appropriate, that's for sure, but only in those situations. So giving it to dexamethasone in the general public, I think we'd all agree is not good. And again, the thing which got my blood boiling is when there was an article actually in Nutritional Weekly, or this thing newsletter we get, saying that turmeric could be contraindicated in COVID because it is an anti-inflammatory. And at the same time, they're saying give dexamethasone. I mean, what do they want? So, and clearly turmeric has hundreds of other benefits, which we've all seen today as well. So, you know, I would say take lots of turmeric and the phytochemicals you've all been talking about all afternoon, of which many of them are proven.
Thank you. Rachel, there's the lady in the white top.
How does fermenting upper gut differ from SIBO?
Same thing.
Okay. And just another question. I've noticed some of the slides were missing. Will we be sent another slides presentation?
Some of the presentations were updated overnight.
Okay. Or this morning.
And early this morning. I heard of people being awake at 2:30 and 4:30, I think it was, and 6:30 resubmitting their presentations. So I think, Rachel, we can issue updated copies, can't we? Absolutely. Yeah. So we'll make those available on the download link within the next couple of days. I think the lady in the red top next to you had a question as well.
It's just a quick question. For how long can one take internal Lugol's?
For life.
And yes.
One thing I do like to do, which I think Sarah does as well, is the patch test. You know, no, you don't do those, just to see how long it lasts on the wrist. And that can help to work out whether the patient is getting saturated over time and perhaps needs a bit less. But that would be.
I'm not sure I trust that. I think it's just a reflection of how quickly it evaporates on the skin.
Do you?
But
okay.
Mark's going to be setting up with me an iodine loading test to be done through Biolab to assess iodine sufficiency.
Good, thank you.
No.
I can take iodine in lots of different ways. It's volatile, so yes, inhaled iodine is very good for acute COVID because it contact kills all the virus. But taking it orally has lots of different benefits.
Can I?
Well, that's 50 milligrams, which is, well, 3 drops of 15% Lugol's iodine. That's 18.5 milligrams per drop, gives you about 50 milligrams, which is reckoned to be the sort of dose you need for iodine sufficiency.
Also, can I say, isn't forward-looking laboratories like Biolab, well, doing urine, iodine loss in urine, was a useful test measuring serum levels of iodine is probably pretty useless, but I think urine excretion and iodine loss could be one of the hidden signs for underlying build-up to hypothyroidism, etc. And anyone else? I think some labs are offering this.
Yeah. Well, we offer the urine iodine. We offer the urine iodine because that's the way of the recommended. Excess iodine is just lost in the urine. So by measuring what's in the urine, if it's a very low level, it means that there's no excess and the patient probably isn't taking in enough. If it's a very high level, if someone's on a good diet with sufficient iodine, they'll have a reasonable urine level. And so you then die. But it changes, you know, in 6 hours, it'll change depending on what they've been, which is why Sarah's looking at the, you know, introducing the challenge test, where you basically derive how much of a known intake of iodine is lost in the urine, so you can tell how much is being retained.
Can I ask, remember back at the start of all this, we did a webinar thing and you introduced the coconut oil with Lugol's iodine. And so I rushed home and made some of that and got through the whole thing in, I don't know, a few months. So I've had the whole bottles of Lugol's iodine on me through that, haven't I? It's obviously gotten into my system. Have you any idea how much you'd be taking?
Well, what, through the skin?
Yeah.
It's about 15% will be absorbed through the skin. But the total body requirement is for about probably between 1.5 and 2 grams, which means that the recommended daily amount of iodine, which is 150 micrograms, is laughably small. It would take you know, years before you achieved iodine sufficiency. But the joy of iodine is it's extremely safe. We don't store it in the body, and if we don't need it, it's simply excreted. But it does lots of other good things as well. It pulls out halides, displaces halides. If there's a nuclear disaster in the next few days, then make sure you're all taking at least 50 milligrams of Lugol's iodine. Contact kills all microbes. It's a fabulous raw material.
If you just wait, we'll bring the microphone to you. It's this lady in the black top, Rachel. Yes, just wait for the microphone. It's behind you.
Just continuing what you were saying, Sarah, I know you talk about the inhaling up the nose, which I do. Are you also saying then you can breathe it into the lungs quite
absolutely? And there are now some very good studies showing the benefit of inhaled iodine for reducing viral loads.
Well, wonderful.
So yes, and I now have 4 patients with bronchiectasis who've done all the regimes, you know, keto diet on, who now sniff iodine regularly using a salt pipe, and their need for antibiotics is reduced to 0. Their lungs have been completely clear, and even one young man with asthma who actually was passing by, and it was a sort of conversation on the quiet, and his need for inhalers has gone to 0. He just sniffs iodine, and it's anti-allergy as well as being anti-infection. So again, it's a gloriously cheap, safe, effective treatment available to everybody. A couple of drops of Lugol's iodine, a salt pipe, sniff it rather than inhale it. If you inhale it, it seems to hit the back of the throat and irritate. If you sniff it, it's a great treatment for any sinusitis, upper respiratory tract infection, and of course, lower respiratory infection. So it's be a great treatment for acute COVID.
I've got an interesting one here about vitamin C. Will a daily dose of vitamin C increase iron absorption, therefore increasing iron levels? And is this appropriate in long COVID?
Well, it also does the other thing by increasing excretion. And I've got 2 patients with hemochromatosis with very high levels of iron. And my advice to them is do a low iron diet, which they do anyway, but take vitamin C, but take it away from meal times. The idea being is it will facilitate excretion, but not promote absorption. And it's difficult to tell if there's an effect because they're also having phlebotomy, but the time between transfusion, or rather phlebotomy, is getting longer and longer.
Okay, so in cases of long COVID, you would still recommend taking vitamin C, but away from
because it protects you from the pro-oxidant effects of the iron. So it's absolutely essential in acute and long COVID. Absolutely.
Okay.
I think it's the citrus bioflavonoids which are just as important as the vitamin C. If I advise a patient, I say if they want to take a supplement, I would take one with the citrus bioflavonoids in with the supplement. Is that just my miss?
It won't do any harm.
That's perfectly reasonable, but I follow the work of Frederick Klenner and the other guy who've used vitamin C for decades and had fantastic results. Cathcart, thank you, Robert Cathcart.
Do we have another question from the audience? There's 3 hands up, Rachel, take your choice.
To add to what Dr. Mahill was saying, I have used nebulizer with iodine in early symptoms of a cold, and it always works very well. My daughters have used it as well. One of them was testing positive, and within 6 hours, after a lot of mucus out, all symptoms improved almost immediately. And someone was asking a question about the polyphenols. There is a company in Vivo, most nutritionists know about it, have a very good supplement, BioMe Essential, with more or less that formula that doctor was talking about. Thank you. Thank you.
Let me give you a microphone.
Sorry. Can the iodine knock out the beneficial bacteria?
Well, we answered this question before. If you're taking it by mouth, you're knocking off the bacteria in the upper gut, and then it's absorbed systemically and excreted in the urine. So it doesn't get into the large bowel. It doesn't upset the microbiome in the large bowel.
This is a rather general question, but to the whole panel. Long COVID is going to be increasing long-term public health problem in an already overburdened system. How can we spread self-help knowledge, i.e. nutrition, lifestyle supplements, to empower the general public? No. How can we? It wasn't a yes/no question. Well, obviously what you're doing is...
well, I mean, you have to do research. I mean, it's fair enough mentioning other supplements with similar properties, but you have to do double-blind randomized trials, and that's what convinced healthcare providers. And, you know, a lot of people will still argue against it. They'll say that there wasn't enough patients in the trial or something, but that is the first step. And that's what convinces other doctors, it convinces people with the money. I'm not saying that we need to convince doctors to get the best health in the nation, but that's a start. You know, the more research we do and place things like this where we can present the results and mainstream journals, I think that's the way forward. And many people would disagree with that, but I'm afraid that's what gets the notice of the public.
And you mentioned you're publishing in some general interest magazines rather than journals.
Yeah, so as well as the mainstream journal, which is the start, you then try to promote it through other ways, such as conferences like this and social media, etc. But you still need the credibility of the mainstream journal.
Absolutely,
yeah. I believe the Alliance for Natural Health has dedicated itself to developing, I won't say alternative, but additional ways of building hubs around the country and so on, and making sustainable health initiatives. So it could be worth visiting their table and talking to them a little bit about it as well. Thank you.
Hi, I've got a question about the natural killer cells and using mushroom powders, because I know some of them claim to enhance natural killer cell.
Could you hold the microphone just close?
Oh yeah, mushroom powder and natural killer cells, and if anyone's using anything or there's been any research. There's some.
Yep, I do very much like to use Agaricus blasi, for example, mushrooms that, and that's a lot of them actually, of the medicinal mushrooms that can help to switch a Th2 response back to a Th1, or at least modulate that. You've got to, of course, always be careful whether you've got an autoimmune component going on, as Sam Yanuk and others have taught us so wonderfully. You know, you've got to sort of modulate between autoimmunity and boosting the immune system. And I think with COVID, you've got to be very careful in general, even with long COVID, not to boost the immune system too much, too excessively. But it'll vary from patient to patient, but certainly I do like using those medicinal mushrooms, generally in combinations, low dose, to support the mitochondria and the cells in general.
Thank you.
I think this one would just get a yes. Dr. Peter Strigner has asked, is there a further likely mechanism for long COVID? Sorry, that doesn't make sense. Is there a likely mechanism for long COVID due to the effect of environmental toxins, e.g. mycotoxins, glyphosate, nickel, Would you agree? We've emphasized that point. I keep losing Rachel. Yeah, this gentleman over there.
Hi, I was just wondering, with the nutritional supplements, how many of you would advise doing a nutritional status test before recommending supplements? They are quite expensive, and that causes a block for many patients.
Yeah, most of the patients who've got this nasty illness haven't got any money. And the fact of the matter, I've now seen so many people, I now know what the answer is going to be. They're going to be deficient. So as the panel know, I call my regimes groundhog regimes, because I keep coming back to talk about them over and over again. And there's a basic package of supplements that we should all be taking, good multivitamin, good minerals, and essential fatty acids. It's just standard. And I don't bother to do tests at that stage because they're expensive and I know what the answer is going to be.
That's the thing with testing. Is it going to change the way you treat the patient? So if you're doing vitamin D testing on somebody in, spring and their level's borderline, you might treat them in a completely different way to how you would if that was the end of the summer.
I did mention in my presentation how I do very much like to do a sort of micronutrient screen if it's affordable for the patient. And I mean, Biolab does do it very affordably. But also, if there is a reactivated virus, it can be very helpful to know what the viral load is and to know that you're going for that rather than for something else. I think the multitude of different syndromes that we've seen, particularly that Rachel has highlighted, does indicate that if you've got hypercoagulation as against high viral load as against, MCAS, that it could help to reduce the number of supplements and other initiatives that you suggest and sort of fast track the patient. So it depends, doesn't it, so much on what's going on and what funds the patient has. I don't know if you want to add to that at all. I mean, do you do testing?
No, like Sarah, I don't test. There are often clinical signs that tell you brittle hair. Look at nails, hair, vascular signs and symptoms, redness of the tip of the tongue, and so on. So quite a few clinical signs you can use also ad hoc in the situation. And I think a lot of this knowledge of good clinical diagnosis, there's the lab on one side. Some patients want the scientific evidence. Others want to just have swift action when they present with a skin itch or a dermatosis or overstimulation of some kind, and then you want to respond fairly quickly. And I think these kind of clinical responses, the knowledge about this has been around for quite a long time. And not only amongst doctors or pups, doctors lose it quicker than anyone else nowadays, but also herbalists, and there are naturopaths who are highly trained in this field, and they have means and ways of alleviating primary symptoms, skin rashes, histamine reactions. There are old concepts known in naturopathic medicine, using, for example, infrared, using releasing the surface is such an interesting naturopathic concept. Releasing the surface, so you make the skin sweat, for example, to excrete toxins. Exercise is one way of doing that. There's also herbs that help expectoration of stuck pathogens in your bronchial tubes. There are ways of NAC is a typical, more pharmaceutical example, but there are many ways of releasing toxins, freeing up the interior stressed organs, and bringing the pathogens or the heat not the heat shock proteins, but signaling hormones that disrupt the system to break the cycle and bring toxins to the surface. And there's a lot of this knowledge, and I think the question was also how do we respond quickly to the current crisis? There should be more health integration is needed. There's a lot of knowledge, but it's a compartmentalized way of thinking about it. And I think the opportunity I can see here, it can all be quite negative and quite gloomy about this whole situation, but it also creates opportunities for coordinating efforts, for becoming more transparent, less defensive of what we know, and share our knowledge more openly. And this is probably a good example here, this forum, where there's a mixed group of practitioners sharing openly information in a crisis situation that demands quicker and swift action and not so much defensiveness. Research and evidence base is one strategy that gives us the backing, but on the other side needs also the dialogue that we speak to each other and share knowledge. That is not necessarily new knowledge. There is a lot of knowledge already in existence. Thank you.
Yes.
Just in terms of whether you should do a blood test and send it to Biolab, which I do, yes. I mean, most patients can't afford it, or they don't want to pay for it. But actually, if you look in, I can't answer for COVID, but if you look at oncology trials, most oncology trials which have looked at, say, vitamin E or some vitamin E, especially in A, selenium, have shown they increase the risk of cancer. So, and I think it's because they were taking excessive amounts, but certainly if you're correcting a deficiency, they're clearly beneficial. But if you're taking too much, they could be harmful. And if they're harmful for cancer, they could be harmful for other diseases such as COVID. So I do like the reassurance to do your test and say, well, actually your vitamin E is low, you should take it. But if they come to me with a whole bag of supplements, including high dose vitamin E or A, which are direct antioxidants, I do get nervous. So, but I don't have the luxury of doing the test in everyone. So you're then limiting it to who's willing to do it. But that's all I can say. I mean, in an ideal world, I would test.
For patient compliance, I don't think we should underestimate the need for patient compliance. I just did a review of patients' vitamin D, and I thought they were doing one thing, and I found out they were doing another. So I do think that we need to be aware of if they can afford it. I totally agree with you, Sarah. But if they can afford it and they need convincing, it's a really important way of convincing them.
And also, we've seen patients where they see a doctor, they do some tests, they're given some supplements, and it says food supplement on the tub. They take the supplement at the recommended dose to correct their deficiency. They feel better because it's a food supplement. They just think, well, it's like broccoli, more is better. So they just keep on shoveling them down for years sometimes. And then we find very high levels, and obviously high levels are not always beneficial. And there is a reference range is there for a purpose in many micronutrients. I'll take one from the webinar crowd, and I think this is probably a quick one. Is garlic effective for removing the biofilm?
It can help. I don't think, I wouldn't expect to do it on its own. No. I was going to say, I was glad that Rachel brought up the biofilm thing, because I do think it's important. And even if they don't produce their own biofilm, viruses can live in that made by bacteria. And generally speaking, most of the biofilms that you see have multiple different organisms in it, bacteria, viruses, parasites, that kind of thing. And there's two things about biofilm. One is that nobody's really pinned this down to my knowledge, but maybe, you're an amazing researcher, Rachel, maybe you can figure it out. Can an infection become chronic without biofilm? Is my question. I don't know that. I suspect the answer is no, it can't, but I don't know. And the other thing is that what you can get with biofilm is part of the cycle typically is what they call dispersal events, when the bacteria living in the thing are suddenly, by reason of some sort of, reach a certain number or whatever, they're suddenly released into the system, into the bloodstream. And at that stage, they, for a few hours, they are very virulent and very resistant to treatment and so forth. So there's another word for that, of course, which is sepsis. And I think that you're right, that it is a good job that most of the biofilm dispersal things that we've got are not that effective. Because if they were really, really effective, it could be dodgy.
Yes. All right. I think we have to call this a day there. So I'd like to round the thank yous now. First of all, I would like to, well, first of all, let's thank Rachel, who put today together. She put today together. She delivered more lectures than she was expecting to, and they were all absolutely fantastic. But I would also like to very much thank all of our speakers. Every lecture today was fantastic. I think we've definitely all learned an enormous amount about long COVID and what can be done, what may be helpful in the future. And it's obviously going to be a steep learning curve for a few years yet. You know, even today, we've got more and more people with long COVID coming on the scene all the time. And they're not in here. I'd like to thank my colleagues who've helped put this together as well. I think they're listening outside. They'll be patting themselves on the back right now. And of course, to thank all of you for taking the time to come, and everybody who's viewing us from home, if you're still there, thank you very much. So thank you, everyone. Let's give all of us a good round of applause. You're on our mailing list, so you'll all hear when we arrange the next meeting. Thank you.